Hello and welcome to Petrichor on the Rocks. I'm Mason. This is the part 2 to the first video. Genesis 1 is about you. This video will draw from that video, so if you haven't seen it, then I recommend following the link in the description and watching it first for context. In the part 1 video, I went over Genesis 1 and the context of the mid-sphere. This is how it personally relates to you. In this video, we will approach the same text from the low sphere. The low sphere is that which we know, so to accord the text with our current knowledge set, it means seeing if we can match it with science by using the context gained from the part 1 of this video. With that in mind, let's see if we can get our knowledge and the text to meet. Because we already broke down the high sphere into the mid-sphere in the last video, we can get rid of a lot of details and boil the story down to its physical claims on each day. Day 0, the earth was void and without form, and there was darkness above the waters. Day 1, light and dark were split. Day 2, waters above and waters below split. Day 3, the earth and the waters below split, and vegetation and trees appeared. Day 4, the waters above were split, and we see the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Day 5, we see another split between the flying things above and the swimming things below. Day 6, we see another split between animals and humans on the land. And then Day 7 is the day of rest. The first question is about the overall scale of the timeline. Science tells us that the whole start of the universe happened around 13 billion years ago. If we compare that to the standard 168-hour-long week, then there seems to be a problem. 13 billion years is slightly longer than a week. But if we go back to the mid-sphere definition we found in the previous video, this problem can be resolved. A day then becomes a period of perception sandwiched between two periods of imperception. Now we aren't talking about 7 exact days, but rather 7 periods of perception. Whose perception? Ours right now. We're looking back in the past and cutting it into distinct periods based on our current focus of interest and what we know. Which means we must block out all other possible periods, thus they go dark in our minds. If we're going to talk about the start of the universe, then we're going to be unable to use equally definable periods because each period we're talking about is a different and undefined length. We just don't yet know exactly how long these periods were. So if we're going to match our current understanding with the Bible, we're going to have to set aside the 7 days as being actual days in the mid-sphere, but in the low sphere they are merely spans of time. Which is another way of saying that anytime you focus on a period of time in the past, you've caused it to become both a literal span of exact time and a period of your perception right now, sandwiched between two periods of imperception. Which is why you don't get confused when an old man says, "back in my day." It would be missing the point to ask him which 24-hour period specifically. We see this same thing reflected in the original Hebrew. The word that has been translated to the English day is yom, which means both 24-hour day and an undefined span of time. So this appears to not just be the conclusion we can get from the text, but what the original author intended as well. With the time spans resolved, we can walk through each biblical day and what science currently understands and see if they accord. On day 0, which is the period before day 1 really begins, the Bible describes the earth as void and without form, and that there was darkness and waters. Science describes the universe as starting with the Big Bang, which is the theory that everything in the universe started with a single extremely dense point and exploded outwards from there, creating everything we see today. But as for what occurred before the Big Bang, or even if there was a before that event, there is zero evidence at all. It really is a complete void in our understanding. In our mid-sphere definitions, we found that water just means place you don't know how to live, aka chaos. And indeed, this pre-Big Bang state of the universe seems not just unlivable, but unfathomable. Even after the Big Bang, the universe remained in this state of uninhabitability. Science tells us that the early stage of the Big Bang was the dark age of the universe because the entire universe was comprised of super dense plasma which didn't allow light to travel at all. And so all that existed was in the form of a vast ocean of pitch dark plasma which had yet to cool enough to form into anything solid enough to produce light, much less atoms and solid matter. So the description that this was chaotic waters, darkness, and void and without form all line up exactly to our current understanding of Earth at this time, specifically that all the electrons and ions that would later come to form the atoms that made up the Earth were just floating within a vast ocean of plasma, so very much without form. On day 1, the first light appears. This corresponds with the first light in our universe, which appears roughly 300,000 years after the Big Bang, where the lightless plasma ocean cools to the point that electrons can bond to atoms, which clears the space in the plasma and allows light to actually move through space. Though this was still relatively dark for millions of years until fully formed stars began to coalesce and emit significant light 100 million years after the Big Bang. At this point, the Earth would have only just started being created in the form of the lighter atoms coming together, like hydrogen and helium. Slowly, out of the birth and death of stars, the heavier atoms that would later make up the Earth and everything else began to appear. By 4.6 billion years ago, Earth is circling the young sun as a cloud of space dust and gases which would eventually gravitationally come together and create a spherical body of the planet. Now being a spherical shape, the Earth is no longer without form. This is the period day 1 is really talking about, the point in which the Earth took shape and light first hit the planet. Even more so, this was the first time in which the spherical planet Earth had two sides. Rather than the space dust from before, now one side of the Earth was always lit up by the light of the sun, while the other side was always dark because it faced away from the sun. In the most real terms possible, the light and the dark were now split in terms of the planet Earth. On day 2, the waters above and the waters below were formed. This is the day that causes the most confusion for most people, and so it's critical to understand what it's saying, or else the next few days will get only more confusing. As we saw in the part 1 video, water is just a place where a person can't live, which really means that it's chaos rather than order. That's what the waters above and below are expressing. It's important to remember that this is the story of the Earth itself, and so chaos is an Earth-centric term related to Earth. That's what the above and the below signify. They are relative terms. Relative to what? To the Earth, and more specifically to where we find ourselves, which is on the surface of the Earth. During the time the Earth was still forming, it was molten, volatile, and spewing boiling gases into the atmosphere. This meant that the surface was a chaotic state of boiling earth, and the atmosphere was a thick mixture of volcanic gases that formed dense clouds blocking out the sky. Thus there was chaos above and below, utterly unlivable to us. This occurred around 4.5 billion years ago. Sure, the Earth had formed into a sphere, but it was anything but settled. It had a form, but that form was chaos all around, completely useless from our perspective as a place that could support life. But the main point was that the chaos was becoming ordered in the form of its organization into the chaos that is up and the chaos that is down. But above and below, what? The answer is you right now, where you stand as you imagine the world from the surface of Earth. The Bible's telling you not to imagine space dust and not to even imagine a molten spinning planet. Instead, imagine the surface of Earth as the lightning cracks in the smothering clouds above and the ground itself sloshes with molten lava and bubbling rocks below. The hot gases want to go up because they are lighter. The heavier elements like iron and stone want to sink lower towards the core of the planet. The chaos is organizing itself and taking shape. Unlike Earth, which is settled and stays, water is fluid and moves around to organize itself. That's what the text is trying to get you to imagine, and that's what science tells us happened during this day. Going forward, it's very important to keep in mind this Earth-centric view, which has an above and a below. This period lasted until about 3.8 billion years ago, thus ending day 2. On day 3, everything that was below from the previous day starts to organize first. The waters below recede and land starts to form. The Earth's surface begins to cool and solidify. The reduction in heat allows for primordial oceans to form together. This occurred roughly 3.8 billion years ago. Once the oceans and dry land were separated, then around 3.5 billion years ago, the first single-celled organisms emerged. Then, shortly after, around 3.4 billion years ago, the first photosynthetic single-celled organisms evolved as cyanobacteria called algae. Finally, around 1.3 billion years ago, the first algae spread onto land in the form of thin bacterial mats which colonized sand and clay soils. These bacterial mat structures were the first land plants, which were the ancestors of all living plant species today. Although they did not have large multicellular seeds like we see in later plants, they did release single-celled spores which spread through the wind, serving the same function. So what about trees? Well, even before photosynthetic algae, fungi started to colonize the land around 1.5 billion years ago, and were even multicellular on land as early as 1.4 billion years ago. When photosynthetic algae moved onto land, they formed a symbiotic relationship with the fungi. The algae creating organic compounds from absorbing the sun's light and sucking nutrients out of the soil, while it was the fungi that consumed the waste and dead matter that got left over and worked to break down rocks by producing organic acids, building upon each other. But because these organisms were made of soft tissue, they left few fossils, especially because fossils are considerably less likely to form on land as compared to the ocean, and given the fact that it was just such a vast, long time ago. So what structures they may or may not have built is largely unknown to us, but what they did do was break down rock into soil and serve as the foundation of all future life on land. The Hebrew word for tree used here is etz, which translates not only to tree, but rather to many things including pole, wood, stick, plank, and to push or press into. The image invoked is meant to be things which push through dirt and insist upon themselves in that way. It's similar with the words for plant and vegetation, which are asev and deshi, which mean green and serves as food for animals, respectively. And indeed, these early photosynthetic organisms did alter the soil and paved the way for that which was to come in the form of more complex life. And that's what the Bible means by trees, not the form of modern trees, but rather the function of all green, soil-moving ecosystem foundations. This was day 3. Although what science would specifically come to call vascular plants didn't evolve till 410 million years ago, with science-defined trees appearing around 390 million years ago. And so what the Bible is describing here is plant life that is green, pushes into the dirt, and is food for animals. This is the same way science describes our modern plants as support structures that use photosynthesis in order to pull nutrients from the ground as the base for all land ecosystems. In this way, both science and the Bible agree that this type of thing came first. So far, this all accords fine, but as we move on to day 4, we find the place where people begin to get really confused. On day 4, we see the appearance of the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and stars, but most people will see a problem here. Wasn't the sun formed on day 1, according to science? Wasn't the earth and the moon formed on day 1 as well? Weren't the plants photosynthesizing on day 3, which requires sunlight? These questions are all answered if you recall that Genesis 1 is an Earth-centric telling of history. The word used for where the sun, moon, and stars are placed is shamayim, which means sky. Sky is a perspectively locked term. If I say sun and you imagine a ball of fire floating in outer space, then where is the sky? There is no sky because you're viewing it from a random point in space. And the Bible describes that the bodies were placed there to separate the day from the night. But out in space, there is no day and night cycle. The sun spins, but you always see it just sitting there in space. The only time you'd have a day and night cycle is if you were on a planet that spun in relation to the sun, creating a light and dark side of the planet. Thus, we are not talking about the sun, the moon, and the stars being created out in space. We're talking about them appearing in the sky above Earth's surface. But how could they suddenly be there? Science tells us the Earth's atmosphere before the first single-celled organism emerged was thick and blocked out the sky. It contained large amounts of water vapor, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane, which formed clouds so thick you couldn't even see the sun. The atmosphere was very similar to the atmosphere found on modern-day Titan, one of the moons of Saturn, but this early atmosphere was still thin enough to allow some light through, which is how early single-celled life began to photosynthesize. So while there was no sun in the sky, there was still light hitting Earth's surface. Had the atmosphere been much thinner, the solar radiation would have prevented anything but deep ocean life from surviving. Once photosynthesis was occurring, it allowed oxygen to be released into the atmosphere for the first time. This caused 2 huge oxidative events, one shortly after the first ocean-based photosynthetic life around 2.5 billion years ago, which took the oxygen content from 0 to about 1% of modern-day levels, and a second oxidative event which occurred around 800 million years ago, where algae evolved to become far more efficient at capturing energy from the sun, which boosted oxygen levels all the way to 40% 80% of modern-day levels. The oxygen released into the atmosphere reacted with the methane by oxidizing it and turning it into carbon dioxide and water. This process cleared the thick haze in the atmosphere over millions of years and slowly created the clear, visible sky of our modern day, a process that ended roughly 600 million years ago with atmospheric oxygen reaching modern-day levels. And with the obstructing haze gone, the sun, moon, and stars appeared clearly visible in the sky for the first time. These celestial bodies had been there in space since day one, but only appeared in the sky after plants made it happen. And that's what the Bible was saying too, just as how on day 3 the chaos of the waters below was cleared, on day 4 the chaos of the waters above was cleared, and it was plants that did it. On day 5, we get the first swimming things and the first flying things. In some translations of the Bible, the large swimming things are called whales, but the Hebrew word used is tannin, which means large sea creature or even sea monster. The day begins around 600 million years ago when the first multicellular and mobile organisms were evolving into what might reasonably be called an animal. Most likely this started with sea sponges and other simple life, but around 541 million years ago it exploded. The Cambrian explosion. Diverse forms of life started to appear in the oceans, and just as the Bible outlines, some of them became quite large, such as the giant sea scorpion, which measures upwards of 8 feet long and is the largest creature yet discovered from this era. As life became more complex, it began to move increasingly into the areas between the land and the sea, chasing the algae patches that moved further and further onto land. These areas were swamps or tidal nurseries, areas of damp, shallow water where water-bound life slowly gained increasing benefit from following plants up onto the land. But the creatures of this time were still highly reliant on water, unable to leave the water for long and reach the more land-based plants that were evolving. The first to attempt this were creatures with shells that gave maximal protection from the harsh sun, allowing them to make limited excursions up onto the land before returning to the water. The increase in semi-aquatic bugs coincided with plants growing taller to make it harder for their leaves to be eaten, which in turn created a huge advantage for any bug that could go up, thus the impetus for flight. It's also suggested that the gill-covered legs sticking out from some water-dwelling insects may have turned out to be useful for navigating and even gliding in the air, which let them rapidly evolve into wings. This vertical space and similarities between gills and wings caused flying insects to evolve in these swampy lands, laying their eggs in water but flying deeper onto land in order to reach plants that semi-aquatic crawling things struggled to get to. This evolution of first flight occurred roughly 400 million years ago in the form of early flying bugs. Some translations of the Bible use the word birds, and while that's not wrong, the original word in Hebrew is oph, which means flying creature. This can include birds, insects, bats, and anything that can fly. And while there were creatures that were coming up onto the land during this time, they were still dependent on water and wet environments to lay eggs and procreate, and were thus not yet true dry land creatures. And so day 5 begins with ocean life and ends with first flight. On the 6th day, we get full land animals and humans. Though they still congregated around swampy wetlands, bugs were starting to branch out. Early arachnids, primitive millipedes, and even lobe-finned fish, which would go on to become amphibians, were increasingly beginning to venture out of the wet and onto the dry land. 365 million years ago, the breakthrough for complete water independence came in the form of amniotes, which evolved to lay self-contained eggs that didn't need to be laid in water, and so the first true dry land beasts appeared. This was the age of the swampy forest and the period where most of modern-day coal was formed, with plant life growing into full-sized trees that formed canopies and sheltered the wet land below, keeping it damp and moist as a sort of microclimate. Gradually, the sheltered wet places expanded outwards into forests, a slow progression onto drier and drier land until around 300 million years ago when the first fully dry land ecosystems emerged. This age is called the Permian period and is considered the first true dry land period of life's evolution, finally giving us full ecosystems made up of creeping things, livestock-type animals, and wild beasts. Categories that science would probably split into something similar to insectivores, herbivores, and carnivores. From there, it's a straight shot to human beings. There's the Permian extinction 252 million years ago, the dinosaurs 230 million years ago, the Cretaceous extinction 66 million years ago, followed by the rise of mammals, and then humans around 300,000 years ago, which brings us to the end of day 6. Day 7 begins with the first humans and with God resting from all these periods of creation. Compared to the vast days that came before, God has only been resting for a tiny sliver, a little pause just for us, to give us a little span of time to ourselves, a time for us to create a bit, a time for us to rule, and so we call this our modern day. And if we look at the timeline, these periods line up incredibly well. Most of the confusion people have comes from either a lack of biblical understanding or an unwillingness to simply follow the patterns the Bible outlines without trying to conform them to preconceptions. That's the Bible broken down into the low sphere. I hope you now see that Genesis 1 and science actually agree. From this we can start to notice a pattern forming. The Bible doesn't ever just talk about one thing at a time. Each passage is multidimensional, spanning all 3 spheres at the same time, talking about these 3 different ways of thinking all together in order to reach each type of person who is biased towards one of the 3 spheres. Which is why the Bible is considered to be divine. No matter which sphere you like best, every section of the Bible has something for you, and that's by design. But what do you think? Please leave any questions and concerns in the comments below, and as always, God bless.